Let me ask you a deceptively simple question. How do you describe where things are? It sounds easy, right? But as we're about to see, the answer to that question unlocks this fascinating puzzle about how our languages literally build our reality, one word at a time. Okay, let's dive right in.
All right, so take a look at this. It's an apple, it's sitting in a bowl. You and I, we'd probably say the apple is in the bowl. Simple. You might just assume that every language has a word for in. But, well, you'd be surprised.
Okay, so for this classic in scene, things look pretty consistent. In Portuguese, it's one word, in Italian, another, Korean, another, Moroccan Arabic, yet another. Yeah, the words are different, but the idea seems to be a one-to-one match. So far, so good.
But now, let's just switch the scene to a cup on a table. And right away, things start to get weird. Get this, Portuguese speakers still use that same word they used before, but Italian switches to a totally different word for on. Korean uses another word, and Moroccan Arabic, it also uses the same word it used for the apple on the bowl. The patterns are already breaking apart. Let's try a third scene, a picture hanging on a wall. And Portuguese, you guessed it, incredibly, still uses that same word. Italian changes again to a third word. But look at what Korean does. It uses the same word it used for the cup on the table, grouping those two scenes together. And for our last scene, an apple on a branch. Okay, let's just recap this madness for a second. Portuguese uses one single word for all four of these very different situations. Italian uses three different words, Korean groups the last three together, and Moroccan Arabic has its own totally unique way of carving things up. So what on earth is going on here?
And that brings us to our first huge question. We are all looking at the exact same physical reality, but our languages are drawing completely different lines and creating different categories for it. How is that even possible? And why does it happen?
So to solve this puzzle, we have to look deeper. We need to look under the hood of these words, like in and on. We have to deconstruct them to find the fundamental building blocks they're all made from.
Researchers call these building blocks semantic attributes. Honestly, the best way to think about them is like Lego bricks of meaning. A word like in isn't one solid thing. It's a structure built from smaller, more basic ideas like contact, inclusion, or support.
And here is the first major clue. When researchers analyzed 16 really diverse languages, they found that a pretty small set of these conceptual bricks was being used over and over and over again. You know, core ideas like, is something higher or lower? Are two things touching? Does one thing contain another? And is one thing holding another thing up?
And this leads to a pretty fantastic insight. It seems like languages all over the world are basically pulling from the same universal toolkit of concepts. The differences we see don't come from the toolkit itself, but from the really unique ways that each language decides to combine these little conceptual bricks to build its words.
This discovery, of course, leads to a massive question. If we're all using the same conceptual Legos, could we actually create a universal map? Is there some kind of single core structure for spatial concepts that all of our languages are secretly built upon?
But I mean, how could you possibly create a map like that? You can't just ask people. You need some way to visualize the hidden connections, the invisible web that's woven by how millions of people talk every day.
Well, scientists use this really powerful statistical tool called multi-dimensional scaling, or MDS, and it's brilliant in its simplicity. First, you just gather tons of data on how people describe different scenes. Then an algorithm calculates the distance between those scenes. If two scenes often get the same word, they're conceptually close. If they always get different words, they're far apart. Finally, the algorithm just plots everything on a map that best fits all those distances.
And they did this on a huge scale. We're not talking about just a few languages. The data for this analysis came from 24 typologically diverse languages, spanning 11 different language families from all across the globe.
The result was, well, it was astounding. All of that data from all 24 languages could be organized onto a single two-dimensional map, a universal map. And it's structured by two main ideas. The first one is simple. Vertical position, is something higher or lower. The second one is what researchers call ground control, which is basically how much one object is supporting or controlling the location of the other.
So, a universal map exists. Case closed, right? Well, not quite. The story gets way more interesting when we start to zoom in. Because while that foundation might be universal, each language uses it to build a very, very different looking map.
Let's see how this actually works.
Let's compare the conceptual maps for English and Mandarin Chinese. So both languages have a concept for inclusion. But the perfect textbook example of inclusion for an English speaker usually involves 3 dimensions, right? Like a fish in a fishbowl. But for Mandarin Chinese speakers, the best examples are often 2-dimensional, like a circle drawn in a rectangle. It's the same broad concept, but a totally different conceptual center of gravity.
Okay, now let's compare English and Moroccan Arabic. Here, the difference isn't just about focus, it's about the overall complexity of the system. So researchers wanted to know what specific semantic bricks were shaping the maps for each of these languages.
And what they found was striking. The English conceptual map showed significant links to 12 different semantic attributes, but the map for Moroccan Arabic, only 5. That is a massive difference.
And here's the crucial point. This goes way beyond just having more words. The underlying conceptual system that English speakers use to organize space is measurably more complex. It's making more fine-grained distinctions than the system that's used by Moroccan Arabic speakers. So let's bring it all together. How do we resolve this puzzle that we started with? How can languages build such incredibly unique worlds from such a shared set of concepts?
The author of the source paper, Mikhail Feast, she summarizes it perfectly. It's not a simple question of universal versus different. Instead, universality and variation are deeply, deeply interwoven.
So here's the big idea. All human languages, it seems, draw from a shared universal toolkit of abstract concepts like contact, support, and inclusion. That's the universality. But, and this is the key, each language uses that same toolkit to build its own unique conceptual house, emphasizing different features, combining concepts in brand new ways, and even varying in its overall complexity. Universality provides the foundation, but variation is the architecture.
And this leaves us with one last provocative thought. If our languages can build such different conceptual worlds out of something as fundamental and physical as space, what other, more abstract parts of our reality, things like time, or emotion, or justice, are being quietly shaped by the words we use every single day?